We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Vav Amud Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 66b. On the previous summit, the Mishnah said that if a bird carbon chatos, if the procedure of the ola is used, so then it is disqualified. And the Gemara says, Deshani b'mai, what exactly is the deviation? What part of the carbon chatos is he doing like carbon ola? Rashi explains, Deshani b'mai achamaisa ola l'shem chatos koi. We're going on a situation again where you have the bird carbon chatos and you're doing the procedure of the bird carbon ola. Umi boile eze davar b'chatos asa kamaisa ola. The question of the Gemara is, what thing did he do like the procedure of ola? What did he do with his chatos like an ola? And the Gemara says, Ilema deshani b'malika. If you're going to say that the difference is he deviated in terms of how the malika is done, as we've said earlier, the malika by the ola sa'of, that malika is done with a full separation of the head and the body, whereas by the chatos it's just one siman. So if that was the difference, he ended up doing a separation, he ended up being mavdil. So then neimo delo Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, then we have to say that our Mishnah does not follow Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. Diyamar, because Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon says, Shamati, I heard, shemavdilin b'chatos ha'of, that we are mavdil by the chatos ha'of, meaning that does not create a disqualification. This also was discussed earlier, and so therefore the Mishnah would seem not to be like Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. But the Gemara says, V'lo kimna delo Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, but didn't we already say that the Mishnah earlier was not like Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, so it would not be such an issue if this Mishnah also did not follow Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. Rashi explains, Inema deshani b'malika shehivdil, if the deviation was that in the malika here he was mavdil, again he separated the head from the body, so nema hadakatani psula delo Rebbe Elazar, then it would turn out that our Mishnah which says that's a disqualification is not like Rebbe Elazar. Umahader hashas, and then the Gemara responds, my kashalach b'hai, what's so difficult about this? Vadai pligi rabbon oleh, the rabbanon certainly argue, v'lav mi ukma stama de pirkin de le'el delo Rebbe Elazar. We just said earlier, in the Mishnah earlier, the unattributed Mishnah, we said in the parak before that it's not like Rebbe Elazar. The katani hivdil b'chatos pasal, because it says over there that if the person is mavdil by the chatos, that's disqualified. And again, Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon does not agree, so that would not be such an issue if our Mishnah does not follow Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. And the Gemara continues, lo, no, we do not have to say that the deviation over here was that he was mavdil by the chatos ha'of, because we could say as follows, deshani b'hazah, that the difference over here, the deviation over here was that by this bird carbon chatos, he changed in terms of the sprinkling of the blood. Rashi explains, lo, kolomar hachafiluk Rebbe Elazar. We could say that this Mishnah even follows Rebbe Elazar, and the change in procedure is something that even Rebbe Elazar would agree is going to disqualify this chatos ha'of. Deshani b'hazah, the difference was in terms of the sprinkling of the blood, meaning shalo hiza, that he didn't do the sprinkling of the blood, ela mitzah, he only did the squeezing of the blood. Shaham mitzah hi avoda sa'ola, doing the squeezing of the blood, that is the avoda that's done by the bird ola, and so that's what he did over here by the bird chatos. Instead of doing that hazah, he just did the mitzah, he just did the squeezing of the blood, and again, that would be a disqualification. And the Gemara says, hachanami mistabra, it makes sense to say this way. Rashi explains, hachanami mistabra dechol shinoi demasnisan b'hazahu. It makes sense to say that all deviations in the Mishnah are talking about deviations in terms of the application of the blood, in terms of the sprinkling of the blood. Why is that? Midakatani seifa, because it says at the end, as the Mishnah goes on, it says, asa lemala k'maisa kulam psula. It says that if he does the procedure on the upper half of the mizbeach in any fashion, it's going to be disqualified. V'afilu k'maisa chatos l'shem chatos. That would be true even if he did the procedure of the chatos for the sake of the chatos. He did it all correctly. He just did it on the upper part of the mizbeach. That was the one incorrect element. And so deshani b'mai. So then the question is, where is the deviation? What's the deviation over here? Ilema deshani b'malika. If you say that what he did was the malika at the upper part of the mizbeach, ha'amar mar, but the master said malika b'chol makom b'mizbeach kasher, that malika actually is kosher in any part of the mizbeach, and so therefore it cannot be that the lamala over here means that the malika was done lamala. Elalav deshani b'hazah. Rather, you have to say that we're talking here that the deviation was in terms of the hazah, and that was done at the upper part of the mizbeach. Umidaseifa b'hazah reishanami b'hazah. From the fact that the end of the Mishnah is talking about the sprinkling of the blood, so we can understand that the beginning of the Mishnah also is talking about the sprinkling of the blood. The Gemara says not necessarily midi area. Do you really have to say that? Hakidi isa v'hakidi isa. Could be one part of the Mishnah is dealing with the hazah, and the other part of the Mishnah is dealing with the malika. And Rashi explains, Deshani b'mai, again, what was the deviation? Ezo avoda lemala, also what avoda was done at the upper part of the Mizbeach. Ha'amar mar gabe chatas ha'of, didn't the master say by the chatas ha'of, bepirkin del in the earlier perek, malika b'chal makom, again, malika is anywhere. Umideseifa de Iri b'shinoi lamala b'hazah Iri, from the fact that the end of the Mishnah, which is talking about a deviation of the upper part of the Mizbeach, that's talking about hazah, sprinkling of the blood. So Reisha Nami de Iri b'shinoi maaseh b'hazah kamairi. So also again, in the Reisha, where we're talking about a deviation of the procedure, we're talking about the hazah, we're talking about the sprinkling. Then the Gemara said maybe not, hakadisa v'hakadisa kol chada v'chada b'mada havashina legabe mairi. Each one is talking about whatever's a deviation for that. Reisha de Iri b'shinoi maaseha, the beginning of the Mishnah that's talking about changing in the actual procedure, one could say that we're also talking about malika. And seifa demaisa malika lo have a shinoi titokim b'hazah. But in the end of the Mishnah, where the malika wouldn't be considered a shinoi if it's at that part of the mizbeach, so that we can say is talking about the hazah, is talking about the sprinkling of the blood. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Olas ha'of, when it comes to the bird carbonol, if the procedure of the bird chatas is used, then it's disqualified. Again, the Gemara asks, Deshani b'mai, what exactly was the deviation in this situation? Rashi explains, Deshani b'mai, hani maise chatas to katani b'mai shani, what procedure of the chatas, what specific procedure are we talking about in the Mishnah? Ilema Deshani b'malika, again, if you're going to say that we're talking here that the deviation was in the malika, Rashi says, Deshani b'malika shalohivdil, that he did not separate the head from the body by this olas ha'of. Midakatani seifa, but from the fact that it says at the end of the Mishnah, we'll see this coming up, it says, Kulon ein metamin bebeis habliya. In all of these cases, there is no tumah bebeis habliya. Tumah bebeis habliya refers to the tumah that happens by a bird that's an avela. When it is swallowed by the person, it conveys a tumah, that's tumas beis habliya. So all of them, there is no tumas beis habliya. Umoalin bohem, and there is me'ilah in all of these cases. Rashi explains, Midakatani seifa kolomar, hadakatani seifa, it says at the end of the Mishnah, it says as the Mishnah is coming up, kulon moalin behen, we're focusing here on the me'ilah. The general halacha by me'ilah is, if the carbon is already permitted, let's say to kohanim, if it's already permitted to the bailim, there we say there's no me'ilah. But when the parts of the carbon, let's say the sacrificial portions that are burnt on the mizbeach, or let's say a carbon which is entirely burned on the mizbeach, so there it is relevant to have me'ilah. And so again, it says that in these cases of disqualification, kulon, in all of these cases of disqualification, moalin bohen, there is me'ilah in these situations. So again, kolomar hadaktani sefer kulan moalin bohen v'koinami a'osa kemaisa chatas l'shem chatas. That's going on in our case right now as well. Let's say you have a carbon ola where you did the procedure of a chatas, you did it l'shem chatas, and apparently there is me'ilah. And so the issue over here is as follows. Nema, we should say, Delok Rabbi Yoshua, we should say that we are not following Rabbi Yoshua. De'ik Rabbi Yoshua, because if we're following Rabbi Yoshua, ha'amar ein mo'alin, he says there is no me'ilah. And Rashi explains, Nema Delok Rabbi Yoshua, we'll have to say that our Mishnah does not follow Rabbi Yoshua, De'u amar ein mo'alin behen b'masnisim, because he's going to say that there is no me'ilah in these cases in the Mishnah coming up. And the reference over here is to the Mishnah that we are about to see. Again, it says in the Mishnah, Olas ha'of, if you have an Olas ha'of, Shasol lemata, where the procedure is done on the lower half of the Mizbeach, it's supposed to be the upper half, but it's done on the lower half. Kemaisa chatas, and the procedure of the chatas is used, L'shem chatas, and it's done as a chatas, as if it were a chatas. So it says, Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Ein mo'alim bar. Rabbi Yoshua says, in such a situation, there's no me'ilah. We'll see Rashi in a moment on that, but the point of the Gemara is that if we're talking here about Malika, Rabbi Yoshua says, Ein mo'alin ba. That's exactly what Rabbi Yoshua is talking about in this Mishnah. And again, it says at the beginning of the Mishnah, v'kulon u'mo'alin bahen, that in all of these cases there is me'ilah. That would mean that the beginning of the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yoshua. So we really have to interpret the beginning of this Mishnah as referencing something that Rabbi Yoshua would not argue with, and therefore we cannot be talking about the Malika. And so the Gemara now continues and says, V'ela b'mitzvah, rather the procedure that was changed over here by the Olas ha'of. Again, when it says that the procedure of the chatas was used by the Olas ha'of, it's talking about the squeezing of the blood. Again, when it comes to Olas ha'of, the blood is squeezed. When it comes to chatas ha'of, the blood is sprinkled. And so over here, that was the deviation. The blood was sprinkled instead of squeezed. And again, in such a situation, Rabbi Yoshua would actually agree that there is me'ilah in such a case. As Rashi now explains, Ela b'mitzvah, rather the deviation over here was in terms of the squeezing of the blood. Uvahalo polig Rabbi Yoshua. By mitzvah, by the squeezing of the blood, with that kind of a deviation, Rabbi Yoshua would not argue. Rabbi Yoshua would agree that there is me'ilah in such a case. As Rashi now explains, the taima, because the reasoning of Rabbi Yoshua is kidir Rav Ada. It's like Rav Ada says. The Yamar, because Rav Ada said, Omer Hoya Rabbi Yoshua, that Rabbi Yoshua says, Ola sa'of sha'asol lemata. If you have an ola sa'of, which the procedure is done in the lower half of the mizbeach, kemaisa chatos, and the procedure of the chatos is used, l'shem chatos, and it's done for the sake of a chatos, nimsheches mishem ola. What actually happens, according to Rabbi Yeshua, is you have now turned that bird from being a carbon ola. It's no longer a carbon ola. V'nasis chatos sa'of. It actually converts into a chatos sa'of, and there's a fundamental difference between a chatos sa'of and an ola sa'of. By a chatos sa'of, Rabbi Yeshua says, again, ein mo'alim ba, there would be no me'ila in that situation because the chatas sa'of is not entirely burned on the mizbeach, like the ola sa'of. As we said, the halacha of me'ila applies specifically to that which is supposed to be burned on the mizbeach. Here it turns into a chatas sa'of, according to Rabbi Yoshua, so there is no me'ila. V'hai time moleka l'memer elo kideshani b'malika. Now Rashi explains this idea that it becomes a chatas sa'of is only true by malika. It's only when the deviation in procedure was by the malika. This will be explained by Rav Ashi later on. Mishum da'ola tzricha shnei simonim, because the idea is as follows. By an ola, again, you need to sever both simonim, both pipes need to be cut through the malika. V'chatas ksheira b'simin echad. When it comes to a bird carbon chatas, just one pipe is enough in terms of the malika. Malikas ola sa'of lemata, and again, the malikas ola sa'of, let's say you do the malika of an ola sa'of, let's say you do that lemata on the bottom half of the mizbeach. The Shinui Neschos Girsa is Umalikas Ola Sof Eina Elo Lamala. Really, it's supposed to be above Vizeh, and again, here we're talking about where it was done Lamata. So again, Ola Sa'of Lamata, Lesa Zeshem Molka Lamata, Ulashem Chatas Besimen Rishon, Hishlim Ba, Kol Maisa Chatas. The point over here is, if this person took this Ola Sa'of and instead of doing it Lamala, he did the Malika Lamata, he did it by the lower part of the Mizbeach, and he did it Lashem Chatas, the moment he finishes one simin, so he's finished and completed all of the procedure of the chatas. It's essentially a carbon chatas. Lefikach yotza ba mishem ola v'nasis chatas. Therefore, it leaves the category of ola and now it becomes a chatas. V'have chatas ov she'asol lemata k'maise chatas l'shem chatas. It's a chatas ov that was the procedure was done in the lower half of the mizbeach. It was done with the procedure of a chatas. It was done for the sake of a chatas. And there, as we said, she'ein ba meila. There is no meila in such a situation. Avol hechad v'malika lo shani. But let's say by the malika, let's say you have a situation where he didn't deviate by the malika, umolka lemala uchamaisa ola, and he did the malika at the upper half of the mizbeach following the procedure of the ola. So then sulo nimsheches b'shinoi de mitzoi. It's not going to then turn into a chatas by changing in terms of mitzoi. Shalom mitzah elahiza, where he didn't do the squeezing, instead he sprinkled kedin chatas lemata lemahave chatas off. So we're not going to say over there that since he sprinkled kedin chatas, therefore it's going to now be considered a chatas off. That we don't say. That's why we're explaining over here that the deviation we're talking about is a deviation in terms of the application of the blood. And again, since there's a deviation in terms of the application of the blood, so there, Rabbi Yehoshua would agree mo'alim bohem that there would be me'ila in such a case, because it still would be considered an ola. But the Gemara continues and asks, but ema seifa, but let's look at the end of the Mishnah. That's the part of the Mishnah we just looked at coming up. Ola sa'of sha'asol lemata. If the ola sa'of, the procedure is done on the lower half of the mizbeach, kemaisa chatas, l'shem chatas, the procedure of the chatas is used and it's done for the sake of a chatas. Again, that was a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Eliezer Omer mo'al in bar. Rabbi Eliezer says there is me'ila. Rabbi Yoshua Omer ein mo'al in bar. Rabbi Yoshua says there's no me'ila. As Rashi explained, it's because it essentially turns into a carbon chatas. There's no me'ila. So deshani b'mai, what was the deviation over there? Ilema b'mitzvah. Now, if you're going to say it's in terms of the squeezing of the blood, Amor da'amar Rabbi Yoshua deshani b'malika. We could say that Rabbi Yoshua would say if the change was made by the malika stage, so then already we can say that Rabbi Yoshua would say there's no me'ila, as Rashi explained. But b'mitzvah miyamar, if there was just a deviation in terms of the stage of squeezing the blood, and again there was sprinkling instead of squeezing, would Rabbi Yoshua say it over there? He would not. So clearly the machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah is talking about where the deviation was malika. So v'ela b'malika. So again, you're going to have to say that's talking about malika. And so therefore we have the following question: Reisha v'seifa b'malika. Does it make sense to say the beginning of the Mishnah and the end of the Mishnah are talking talking about Malika, umitziyasa b'mitzvah, and then the middle part of the Mishnah is talking about mitzvah. Does that make sense? And the Gemara says, yes, reisha v'seifa b'malika. One can say that the beginning and the end of the Mishnah are talking about Malika, umitziyasa b'mitzvah, and the middle part of the Mishnah is talking about mitzvah. That is not a problem. And Rashi explains, Reisha b'Malika, are we going to say the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about Malika? Mishum debois l'ukma delok Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, because we said at the top of the Yamud, we wanted to say that the Reisha of the Mishnah is not like Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. Kidi tukma stam be'idach pirkin, like we said in the other parak. V'hach seifa pluksad Rebbe Yoshua, al karchach b'Malika, and also the end that we just quoted, that Machlokas Tanoim with Rebbe Yoshua certainly is talking about Malika, and mitziyasa b'mitzvah, and then the middle part of the Mishnah is talking about squeezing the blood, to titukma Rebbe Yoshua, because there we wanted to say that it is following Rabbi Yoshua, Mishum Rabbi Eliezer Shamutehu, because Rabbi Eliezer is Shamute. We generally do not want to say that the unattributed parts of the Mishnah are following Rabbi Eliezer. And the reference over here to the Reisha is again at the top of the Yamud. The Gemara said, Deshani b'mai, lema deshani b'malika. The Gemara suggested Malika and said, Nema delok Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, again to suggest that that part of the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, because we said in the last parak also, it doesn't follow Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. So again, the question of the Gemara was, are we going to say the beginning and the end are talking about Malika, and the middle case is talking about Mitzoy? And the Gemara said, indeed, that is not a problem. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, V'chulon ein metamin bebeis habliya. All of these cases, they're not tameh bebeis habliya. This is talking about all of the cases where there's a disqualification because the wrong procedure was used, as the Mishnah explained earlier. So in all of these cases, there is no tumas beis habliya. Rashi explains, V'chulon afa pishen nifsalu melikasan mitaharasan midei nevela. Even though we're talking about a situation where the bird chatas, the bird ola, is disqualified, but still the malika that was done is effective enough that it purifies it from being considered a nevela. If it would be considered nevela, then it would be tameh. Ve'ein mitamin bebeis habliya. Again, there's no tumas beis habliya. Kedin nivlas oftar. The nevela of a kosher bird generally is mitame bebeis habliya. But again, over here, that tumah is not going to apply. The malika will be effective enough to be mitarid from being a nevela. It won't be considered a nevela. Umoalin bohem, and this is the part of the Mishnah we just quoted earlier. Umoalin bohen, and there is meila in all of these cases. Chutz mechatas ha'ov sha'asol lamata kemaisa chatas l'shem chatas, with the exception of the case of the chatas ha'ov, where the procedure was done at the lower half of the mizbeach, the procedure of the chatas l'shem chatas, for the sake of the chatas. So there already it's a carbon chatas in a situation where it is a carbon chatas. So there, as we said earlier, there is no meila in that situation. And Rashi explains, umoalin behen, there is meila v'af bechatas, also by the chatas hoel v'nifsalu. In the case where the chatas was disqualified, there's going to be meila. Ve'ein behen shas heter lekohanim, since there was no moment where the meat was permitted to the kohanim, lo yatsu midei meila shebehen. So therefore, it never leaves that status of meila. If there's a disqualification and it's never permitted to the kohanim, so therefore again there is going to be meila. That's why the Mishnah is saying in all of these cases there is meila, except for the case of the chatas ha'of, which was done properly. So again, in that situation, it is permitted to the kohanim, and there is no meila. And the Mishnah continues with the machlokas tanoim we just mentioned earlier. Olas ha'of sha'asol lemato kemaisei chatas l'shem chatas. What about an olas ha'of where the procedure is done in the lower half of the mizbeach, and the procedure is done entirely like a chatas? And again, we said this is talking about the malika. So already from the stage of the malika, essentially it might transfer into being a chatas. So here we have a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Moalim Bar. Rabbi Eliezer says there is meila. It's not treated like a chatas. But Rabbi Yoshua Omer Ein Moalim Bar. Rabbi Yoshua says there is no meila because it is treated like a chatas in this situation. And the Mishnah continues. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says Umayim chatas she'ein moalim ba lishma kishashina es shema moalim ba. If when it comes to a chatas where there is no meila, if it's done lishma by a chatas, so when there's a deviation, when it's not done for its sake, so then we say that there is meila. So ola shemoalim ba lishma, by ola where there is meila when it's done properly for its sake, kishashina es shema. So when it's changed, when it's not done for its sake, eino din sheyimalu ba, isn't it logical to say that there would be meila? That's Rabbi Eliezer's argument that there should be meila. And the response, Amar le Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Yoshua says to him, he says to Rabbi Eliezer, Lo imamrit bechatas shashino es shema l'shem ola, by a chatas where you changed it and did it for the sake of an ola, shekain shino es shema l'davar sheyesh bo meila. There, the deviation was to something where there is meila, so it makes sense to say there's meila. Tomar ba'ola shashina es shema l'shem chatas, whereas by an ola where where the deviation is that you're doing it for the sake of a chatas. So would we say shekein shino as shema ledavar she'ein bo meila? There, the deviation was to something where there's no meila, so it makes sense to say that there is no meila. And Rashi explains, Chutz me chatas ha'of she'asa lamata k'maisei chatas l'shem chatas, with the exception of a chatas ha'of that is done properly, it's done lamata, it's done at the lower half of the mizbeach, like a chatas, l'shem chatas, diksheri, because that's a kosher chatas, v'yesh lo shas heter l'kohanim. Therefore, there was a time when it's permitted to the kohanim. Once it became permitted to the kohanim, v'shuv ein ba me'ila afila lazar, there's not going to be any liability for misuse for me'ila, even for a non-kohen. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Moal in Ba, Rabbi Eliezer says, there is me'ila. Again, that's talking about in the situation of the olas ha'of, where you do the whole procedure of the chatas ha'of. Rabbi Eliezer says, the ha'olahi, because it is an ola. Umi hotzia mimilasa, so what takes away the me'ila? Shas heter l'kohanim einla. There is no permitted, there's no moment of permission for the kohanim in this case, so there's me'ila. Rabbi Yoshua Amar ein moel, and Rabbi Yoshua says, no, there's no me'ila. The kevan deshina shema u'maaseh u'mekomo l'shem chatas, since he changed what the sake that it was done for, since he changed its procedure, since he changed his location as a chatas, so nasis chatas, it becomes a chatas. Kedem Mefarsh B'Gemara, as the Gemara will explain, as Rashi also explained earlier, u'machatas she'in moalin lishma sharei necheles l'kohanim. And so the argument was, if by a chatas again, where it's eaten by the kohanim, there's no me'ila, but shino es shema upasla, but if you deviate and disqualify it, v'lo ba lichlal heter, and therefore there is no permission for the kohanim at all, moal in ba, there is me'ila, the Rabbi Yoshua gufe lo palagala, even Rabbi Yoshua would not argue in that situation. If you have a chatas ha'of, which you disqualify by doing it for an ola, so then we say that there is going to be me'ila, ledavar sheyesh ba me'ila, and so then the Mishnah said, the question is whether you're deviating to something where there's me'ila, l'shem ola, meaning you're doing it for an ola, and ola is relevant to, ola has me'ila, and so therefore that is the counter argument, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Zayin Amud Aleph.